Well, hello everyone. Happy Saturday. Welcome to my room. Today we're going to be talking about synchronicity. And as you can see, I am back in form. The sty is mostly gone. My health is mostly back. And it's an important thing because this topic is a complicated one to unpack. I should say that this topic is an easy one to talk about, but to say meaningful things about is not easy. And yet I think there is a bit of a hunger on the part of the community in general, people in general, to get a firmer grip on the meaning of synchronicity in Jung, and consequently, and whether the concept has been used correctly or incorrectly, creatively or not since then. So before we jump into it, just remember, you can follow me on Patreon. The link is down below, and your support is massively helpful in allowing me to keep the channel going. So I really appreciate my patron support. Also, you can suggest topics for me to discuss and you get priority. So don't forget that. And then there's my two books, The Ecstatic Soul, my book on the INFJ. Check it out. Links below, less than $10. And same for The Infinite Castle, my new novel, if you're interested in reading like psychological exploration of a man's unconscious, probably an INFJ. Check it out. Okay, so synchronicity. What I'm likely to title this video, because at the time that I'm recording this, I haven't quite decided what the title of the video will be, but I'm very likely to call it something like Jung's most controversial theory or Jung's most controversial concept. I'm interested in looking a little bit at the genealogy of this concept, what it means for Jung, and also perhaps of what it means for in the context of the NI dominant, the INTJ, the INFJ, or strong NI users, maybe ENFJs and ENTJs with very developed NI, because these exist and these are not actually emphasized enough, in the community. We tend to think of ENFJs and ENTJs as very much dominated by their dominant, and that makes sense, but, sometimes they can also be very, very NI driven in a lot of ways. Just in the same way that you might encounter INTPs that seem to be very NE driven, and they seem borderline cases between INTP and ENTP, but this is beside the point. So synchronicity, what's interesting about this concept is that a lot of people nowadays, when they speak of synchronicity, they think of it as, very broadly speaking, because I think the implicit understanding of people is broad and general and not necessarily very specific, is the coincidence of two or more events that are meaningful in a way that cannot be explained in terms of our usual scientific apparatus, physical apparatus, the physicist apparatus of causality, more specifically, cause and effect. In other words, that there might be an event happening and a simultaneous event happening that are clearly connected. We see them as clearly connected. And yet there's no way, or it seems to be that there is no way that the one causes the other, that it can be any scientifically stamped causal relationship between them. So that's kind of how we understand synchronicity most of the time, right? And in fact, it is not that far from how Jung defines the term. He often calls synchronicity a coincidence, meaningful coincidence. I think he has other ways of characterizing it. He sometimes talks about meaningful simultaneity, simultaneous event, a causal connection between simultaneous events. But meaningful coincidence is I think quite sufficient, really, because it already presupposes simultaneity. Now, the thing about simultaneity that we need to emphasize is that it doesn't have to be simultaneity in time. It can also be simultaneity in space. So you can have two events happening, like two meaningfully connected events happening at the same time in different parts of the world, but you can also have a simultaneity of meaning between one event in time at time t and then another event that happens later on, right? So it doesn't have to be, the events don't need to be simultaneous in the sense that they happen at exactly the same time from our perspective. So an example examples that Jung uses a lot, and this is really where we begin to see that he starts getting into more spiritual, speculative, and controversial territory. Because that's in volume 9 of his connected works, right? Until then, Jung has been mostly quite scientific. Honestly, even in the way that he's been approaching the collective unconscious, as we will see in a second, synchronicity is really the step he makes where his conception of the collective unconscious, because the collective unconscious is central to this conception, or the concept of synchronicity, that's where it becomes much more speculative and likely to be castigated as pseudoscience by hard-nosed scientists, hard-nosed materialists, whatever you want to call them. He uses examples often of foreknowledge, so he would talk about examples that he's had of patients who were essentially able to predict the future or to anticipate, have an apprehension about someone dying, and then a few weeks later the person dies, and there was no way for them to know that there were any conditions that would have made it more likely for the person to die. Sometimes they lived on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean in America or whatever that might be. So intimate preconceptions of something happening that does happen, even though there was just simply no way that there could have been a causal relation between the two. So he talks a lot about that. And in fact, this form of synchronicity, because synchronicity can take different forms, is not a connection between a meaningful coincidence of two physical events, right, or two events in the world, two public events, if you like. It's a meaningful coincidence of a mental event, an apprehension about someone's death, and then the actual public event of the person's death. And Jung says in his works that part of why he's been so compelled by these instances is that he has dealt with 10,000, 20,000 cases. He has a huge amount of data at his disposal. And he's able to really pinpoint that these cases, they're not common. He never says that synchronicity is something that happens often. From the point of view of our everyday temporality, synchronicity is a rare thing. And even more rarely can it be established to a degree that satisfies Jung himself. But it's still regular enough. It's regular enough. It might not be common, but it's regular. It does happen. And there are analogies, strong analogies between the different cases, strong enough that he considers. Essentially, he considers that it's exercising too much of a pull on our intuitions, that it is not sufficient for a science point of view to just say, well, if it's not causality, it's chance. And if it's not chance, it's meaningless. But Jung specifically explains that the causality is out of the picture. We're dealing with an acausal principle, or we're dealing with chance. He's aware that, like these coincidences could just be chance. And so he has a lot of explorations of what could it mean for these events and these coincidences to just be chance, to be chance events, to be luck, so to speak, or lack of luck in the case of someone dying. But and in fact, it's kind of interesting because he decided to do some work on these cases with a mathematician. He did experiments. I'm not going to go into the detail because it'd take too long to get into, and I might get confused myself because it's quite complex. But he has these experiments he makes and gets certain results. He also looks at astrological pairing. So again, really opening up the sphere of what he's willing to consider an object of study. But working with a mathematician, and a friend of his and an advanced mathematician at the time, they essentially come to the conclusion that for some of these events to have taken place as chance events, the statistical likelihood that they would have occurred was so infinitesimal, like 1 in 8 million or 1 in 20 million, that it might as well just not actually be chance, because a chance event, okay, it's a chance event, but if it has a statistical level of likelihood, it's actually extremely unlikely. It becomes extremely unlikely that this is chance. Not strictly impossible, but unlikely, because the statistical likelihood is just too tiny. And that leads Jung to think about how we are often too easily tempted to think that just because of an event, the event is extremely unlikely, then it's just chance. But in fact, there is such a thing as too low a probability for even chance to be a reasonable candidate. So he does make an effort to try to articulate what synchronicity is and how it can come about and how we can establish by elimination that it's neither causality or chance. But that does not really give us an account of what synchronicity is. How can there be meaningful coincidence objectively in the world? Because if we think of a meaningful coincidence as something that's objectively in the world, then we are forced to make the further step that meaning is objective, that there are meanings in the world. And that we can't really make sense of this, because I know, that I'm looking at the glass, and the glass means something to me. It also means something to society, but it's the concept of a glass, just like the concept of money, is something that doesn't seem to have any meaning without the existence of a human mind, of communication between people to give them meaning. What John Searle calls the social construction of reality. Now, that's where it gets even wilder for Jung, and where I think you can really see the INFJ at work, the NI dominant at work. Is that he says, but maybe for us, we don't live in a world in our conscious everyday experience where meanings seem to float around objectively. But what about the world of the collective unconscious? What about the world not of the personal unconscious, the one that Freud touched incompletely but did touch, but the collective unconscious, the world, the subterranean world that Freud did not touch, and eventually essentially caused the rift between Jung and Freud. It says, if the world of the collective unconscious is the world of the archetypes, and the archetypes are essentially the forms of all possible patterns of experience, perhaps the archetypes are connected fundamentally with something that is actually transcendental, in the sense that the archetypes are in our collective unconscious. They're connected with our collective unconscious. But maybe the archetypes exist as something that actually is beyond humans. It's almost as if here Jung gets into a form of potential openness to panpsychism, the idea that, consciousness, or at least proto-consciousness, here in the form of the subterranean part of consciousness, the collective unconscious, would be existent in reality and in everything. If that is the case, then perhaps meaning comes with the collective unconscious. Meaning is embodied in the archetypes and exists everywhere. Humans are not. And in this case, what appears to us as a meaningful coincidence is something that essentially was determined by these archetypes. We are surprised by it. We cannot accept that it is anything else than either cause or chance, or something meaningless that was made up, because we cannot think in terms of our everyday experience with the archetypes in mind. The archetypes are always something that we can access by them being presupposed or intuited, and I'll come to that in a second as I conclude. But maybe the meanings happen there, and that's how these meaningful coincidences occur. As to why they occur rarely, it remains a mystery. The archetypes don't tell us that. But it is at this level that Jung is envisaging the possibility of synchronicity, the origin of it. And again, what's very INFJ about it, or at least very NI dominant about it, is that if you think about Jung's conception of the anti-dominant as someone who is intuitively attuned to inner contents, including images from the unconscious that give quicker access to archetypal symbols, or rather symbols that stand for archetypes, because archetypes cannot be represented. Symbols are imperfect attempts to grasp the archetypes, but INFJs innately connected to those symbols in the same way that an extroverted perceiver might be innately more attuned to perceiving things in the external world. So here we have, an attunement with archetypal contents. So of course it puts Jung in a better position to be able to theorize about these archetypes and theorize about the collective unconscious. You can say the exact same thing about Rupert Sheldrake, by the way, if you know him, because the concept of morphic resonance is incredibly similar to what Jung is talking about here in terms of the collective unconscious and the archetypes actually transcending the realm of the human. So I think that's possibly a strength for Jung, because it means that he was, as an INFJ, was ideally suited to notice these patterns and to make that hypothesis about synchronicity. But you could also see it as weakness, in the sense, and according to Jung's own reasoning, that, well, having a particular kind of psychological makeup, determines you in some sense to holding certain types of views. So given his connection with these inner contents, Jung was more likely to think that applied across the board for everyone, whereas it might only apply for anti-dominance. But I leave that as an open question. Bit of an abstract one today, but I would be curious to know if you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments. Tomorrow may be a slightly more fun one. Don't forget about my Patreon. See you soon, guys. Bye-bye.